base d'une autorité de protection indépendante, mais également l'adoption de textes de portée internationale sont nécessaires. Je vous remercie de votre aimable attention.
Well, it's an honor and a privilege to be here and to be on the panel with Commissioner Madhub and the Commissioner from Burkina Faso. I was asked to talk about privacy in the developing world and to have a bit of a focus on Asia. But before I begin, just a little bit about me. I work for the GSMA, which is a global trade body for 800 mobile phone operators around the world. We operate in over 219 countries. And just a bit of some statistics to it, there are currently 7.2 billion connections in the world that equate to 3.6 billion people. And when we're talking about privacy in this stage, it's absolutely huge. Could I ask, how many of you have a smartphone? That's great to see. How many of you think you understand and are able to manage your privacy on your smartphone? Significantly less than put the hand up on ownership. And that's one of the challenges, I think, for us. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the ASEAN, just very briefly, before I get on to what I see some of the key challenges, and to pick up some of the points that Peter Hustings and Jakob and others have talked about today. The ASEAN published this document, and I think a key piece of it is that they want to include people in this. And it will be interesting to see the degree to which they do take a user-centric approach, and some of the concerns that were discussed earlier about addressing, I think Peter finished it off and rounded it off with risks, ethics and accountability, the degree to which that is in there, because what this is asking for is that ASEAN members will introduce codes of conduct on data protection. So Myanmar, for example, has agreed as part of its membership to ASEAN that it will introduce a code of conduct on data protection. And it is just issued licenses for mobile operators, for example. So that's going to be quite interesting, I think. And of the ASEAN members, only approximately 3 have laws. And I do apologize that you can probably not read this bit. This talks about some of the challenges that we face in the mobile space. And I think back to the fact that there are 3.6 billion people with mobile devices around the world. And the conversation today has been about data protection authorities and data protection acts. And I haven't heard mention of the fact that in many of the countries in the developing world, and certainly where our members are, there may not be any omnibus data protection laws at all. So what do you do? But there are telecoms legislation that apply to telecom operators. There are license conditions that apply to telecom operators. There are codes of conduct that apply to telecom operators. Could I ask those of you that are here, and many of you have traveled from overseas, how many of you are using apps to make phone calls and send messages rather than your traditional device? So you might be using Skype, WhatsApp, Viber, I could go on. So what you will find in these frameworks is your use of those services are not regulated by these telecommunications rules because they're not considered to be telecommunications services. So what I see here is an asymmetry in the way that law applies, and it creates asymmetries in the value of data, and it creates asymmetries in privacy. Because what we find in many of these telecom licenses and these codes of conduct is that it imposes express conditions and restrictions on operators that they are not allowed, for example, to use proprietary data for secondary purposes, even often with consent. Even often they cannot share data with third parties, even with consent. And the other thing, there have been discussions today about the issues of transferring data overseas and how digital economies, so if you think back to ASEAN, and I think back to many of the digital strategies of some countries, it's about driving the digital economy, and that requires data to flow across borders. But yet, what we find in these license conditions, and I can name a number of countries, is that you are not allowed to transfer data overseas. I could, for example, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and other countries. And that's a particular challenge when you are trying to, if you are a global company, trying to create consistency, trying to put accountability frameworks in place, etc., and trying to compete in a market where, as we've just discussed, others are not subject to those same rules. And I think also we talk about, so there's a conflict there with the data protection legislation, for example, and I don't see, how many telecommunications regulators do we have in the room? None. 3.6 billion people connected. 30% of mobile users in Mauritius, for example, are on 3G. 120% penetration rate here in Mauritius. That's great. So I think part of what we have to do, and I think the great thing about this forum, and I see Julia over there, is how do we bring different regulators together to discuss these things? Because each of the regulators that I have listened to has said that this needs a new way of thinking. This needs to be about addressing risk. Well, if it is about risk, why are we legislating for particular infrastructures and technologies? Why aren't we seeking to understand and identify the risks that emerge in particular contexts? And why aren't we trying to create consistent experiences for privacy? I think Alan Chang, I don't know if Alan is still in the room, Alan mentioned that. That's really, really important. Just going to go through here. No, it's gone. And let me tell you about, I'm not going to name the country. So we talk about privacy, and we can do all that we can in the world to protect people's privacy. And then in this particular country, there is a direction that's been issued by one of the multimedia authorities to mobile operators that has required the establishment of a database for the registration of phones that have been lost. So many of you might have your phone stolen or lost, and the mobile operators have worked around the world in order to block those phones being used by criminals. In this particular country, this direction has been issued such that mobile operators have to supply, within 48 hours, the following data to a third-party database, which is name, national identity number, billing address, your mobile phone number, IMEI, that's electronic serial number of your phone, the IMSI, which is electronic serial number of your SIM card, your device model and identity number, and your MAC address. And it must be updated within 5 minutes of you changing any of those details. Now, in that particular country, there is no legal framework that's been introduced to regulate the investigatory powers of the state. So when we talk about privacy, we can't just talk about a bit of marketing. We can't just talk about the fact that Amazon know what video I've just bought and would like to offer me another deal, because I find that, personally, of great value to me. So I think we have to think about some of these things. I also think that in one of the countries, for example, in Indonesia, there is an Electronic Information and Transaction Act. And that's really something very interesting in that act, because what it says is that individuals should have a privacy right, should be to communicate with other persons without surveillance. A privacy right should be the right to enjoy personal life and be free from invasion. I think that's quite incredible. Now that's an Electronic Information and Transaction Act from 2008. That isn't enshrined in a Data Protection Act because they don't have one. So where I operate and where I talk with our members, it's often that there is no law at all. I'm conscious that I'm keeping from coffee, so I won't keep you too long. And Alan Chang was quite correct. This isn't about the law only. Because I think if all you do is seek to comply with the law, you will never meet the privacy risks facing your customers. You will never design for them, because this is about designing for trust. Commissioner Madhub was quite eloquent earlier today, and the Minister was quite eloquent about the importance of privacy and data protection to driving trust in the digital economy. And it is fundamental because there is a lack of trust at the moment. So we've done research on 11,500 people around the world in 8 countries, including Malaysia and Indonesia, for example. We do have other countries planned. And overwhelmingly, we can see that 83% of people are concerned about apps and services accessing their information without their knowledge and without their permission. We see that 60% of people, of these 11,500, want consistent rules to apply. So if you think in Europe, for example, and often in other places of the world, your mobile location data that's generated inside a mobile network is highly regulated. But your wireless LAN and your GPS data processed by Google or Facebook or others are not subject to those same rules. I don't believe that that creates an approach that leads individuals to be aware of when they need to make a privacy decision and how they need to make a privacy decision. And I've just noticed Google in the room, so there you go. Hi, William. And I think, and I apologize now to the lawyers in the room, but 8 out of 10 users agree to privacy notices without reading them because they're too long, but they're also too legalistic. So I think we need a new way of doing this, because part of the challenge is how we design for trust, how we design to enable people to make decisions in a meaningful way. How many of you use your mobile phone while you're walking along? Staring at, come on, be honest, just in Vice, they can see you, you must do it. People do this. People are engrossed in their devices. They're engrossed in a context, in a situation, in a relationship. And you're trying to intrude in that. So they're not switched on to being alert to something and making a decision. I can tell you now that there's one social network that if I want to check in, I go through 4 steps on one particular device to check in. If I don't go back through those 4 steps and disable location and do a status update, it automatically takes my data, my location data. That's because smartphones are architectured to broadcast data by default, and the ecosystems upon which they depend and that support them are architectured and set to collect data by default. And that requires, again, a different way of thinking. So we talk about, so how do we do this? Because in many of the countries, as I say, that we operate in, there are no laws, apart from teleco rules. And we are not Facebook. Our members are not Google. They're not one single entity who can take one single approach. It may be that in one country we have 5, 6, 7 operators, all with competing interests, commercial interests, that we have to bring together. And we've been very successful in bringing people together to say, okay, if there are no laws, what do we do? Do we say that people simply are not entitled to privacy? What do we do about generating this trust? So we've established privacy principles that are being adopted by many of our members around the world. We've produced app privacy guidelines. I did put some out there. And these guidelines have been incorporated into other guidelines. The California Attorney General's Office, for example, the Australian Privacy Commissioner, even the UK regulator has looked at these and engaged with us on them. And we've also, and I know Marty Abrin is in the room, as is Brianna Bellamy, incorporated the work of the Centre for Information Policy Leadership on accountability into an accountability framework. Because it's insufficient simply to have a set of words. You need to be able to demonstrate to people that you are living these words, that they can trust you. And then you may have seen some little brochures that has the research on that we've produced the main stats for policymakers. There are still more outside, but they're all available online. So what does this mean? I think increasingly, the conversations today have been about existing laws. The conversations today have been about existing privacy enforcement networks, whether that is GPEN or the Ibero-American network. It's talking about APEC. But in many of these countries, there aren't laws. There aren't the data protection authorities. There aren't the networks established. So what do we say to the billions of people that are connected or hoping to get connected? If I look at Kenya, for example, Kenya, 98% of access to the internet is made via mobile devices. 98%. Similar figures in Ghana and elsewhere. Mobile is very important for accessing the internet, particularly in Africa and in other parts of the developing world. And, you know, even yesterday, and this is to pick up on Peter's point, and to give Jakob has just shot out of the room, so that's a pity.